Anu Gupta, welcome to Partnering Leadership. I am thrilled to have you in this conversation with me.
Thank you so much for having me. I am thrilled to be here.
Can't wait to get some of your insights and talk about your book, Breaking Bias, Where Stereotypes and Prejudices Come From, and the science backed method to unravel them. Before we
Mhm.
get to that, though, Anu, we'd love to know a little bit more about you. Whereabouts did you grow up, and how did your upbringing impact the kind of person you've become?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, first of all, to everyone who's listening and for being a part of this conversation. I think for me, this book is really a product of my life's work. It's also a product of my life's journey. I've had a really unique upbringing. I was born in India and my family immigrated to the US when I was 10 years old. Since moving to the US, particularly right before going to college, I've lived in a bunch of other places, from Myanmar and Taiwan to South Korea, Singapore, India, of course, the UK, Mexico. So just have had a really global lens on understanding the topic that we're talking about, which is bias. So I grew up in India, grew up in a, I would say, upper middle class family, Hindu family. And just growing up, I just felt a sense of tension. I was in Delhi that was rooted in a lot of different human identities, particularly gender, right? My mom, who's a surgeon, she worked all day, but she was also expected to do a lot of housework, come and cook and take care of us. But my dad wasn't. He too worked, but he came home and he was just lounging in front of the TV or getting to hang out with his friends. So I like, saw those double standards that were quite apparent around the lens of gender, but also around class. And something that I discovered in college, caste, which I wasn't familiar with at all growing up in India and even going up in the US afterward. After moving to the US, of course, I was the same exact kid that I was in India. Suddenly, tables turned and I became an untouchable within my community because of the way I spoke, because of my skin color, because of my name, and a lot of perceptions people had about who I am because I'm Indian or Hindu descent and a whole host of things. So for me, as a recent immigrant, I just felt everything within me and just did what I was told to do by my parents, by my teachers. This was like the 1990s, right? And then just study hard, excel, do your best, and prove them wrong. That's what I did. And I did that really well. After 9/11, the name calling got a little bit worse because it wasn't just people in my immediate circle. It would be strangers coming up to me calling me Osama bin Laden and telling me to go back to where I came from. But I would just like, you know what? It's okay. People have their reasons. Just being the good Asian immigrant I was, I continued to just do that work. Things really hit home for me when I went to law school. This was about 15 years ago. I was a second year law student. And in law school, everything we're doing, whether it's talking about criminal justice or contracts or torts, a lot of the substantive laws of our country were built upon our history, a really dark history around enslavement and forcible removal of indigenous people and Chinese exclusion acts. But there was very little acknowledgement of the experience of bias that people had within the legal classroom. And when I would share from my personal example, I would feel really unsafe and oftentimes gaslit, like denial of my emotional experience. And that hit home for me and basically made me feel like maybe I'm crazy. Maybe the world outside me is great and it's me who's the problem. At the beginning of my second year law student, I found myself on the ledge of my 18th floor window, about to jump off. Literally standing there, I was going to jump onto the Midtown Manhattan traffic below me. But this is where the mystery of grace comes into play because I actually don't know what happened. But instead of falling forward, I fell backward into my apartment. And for me, that moment was like, oh crap, what was I going to do? So I immediately called someone who happened to be walking in my neighborhood. And she came over to my apartment, talked me down probably 6 to 8 hours. And I went to the NY Counseling Center the next day. And that's where my journey began, really. My journey of breaking biases within myself. Because that lifetime of experiences trained me in certain stories, false stories about who I am and who I'm supposed to be. And that affected the way I saw myself and how I saw others. And that journey of breaking bias within then became a professional calling. When I started sharing my story with other folks, they were like, me too. This has happened to me as well. Like I've suffered so much. And then of course, witnessing the inequities and injustices, but more than that, the inefficiencies, right? The loss of talent, all rooted in this idea of bias. So for me, that's where the calling began. I started my company 10 years ago and the book came out of that really organically, piecing together the story of what bias is, how we're not really wired for it, but how we're trained in learning bias. And then, of course, how can we unlearn bias using the best of modern neuroscience, but also ancient wisdom, right? This isn't something that science has discovered. It's something that science has given language to, but our species has known for thousands of years.
I love your origin story. It's obvious that you haven't written a book to write a book and to be an author. You've written a book to make a difference, and your story helps convey that. Now, the pendulum, to a certain extent, have swung where a lot of people
Mhm.
say, why is it that it's now only the experiences of a certain subsegment of society that needs to be prioritized or understood? What would you say to that before we talk about how we can discover some of those stereotypes and prejudices to address them?
Yeah, yeah. It's such a beautiful question and it's an important one, right? Because just imagine if you're a child growing up in an abusive household and every day you're told you're ugly, you're stupid, you're beaten. And then you grow up as an adult, you're 20 years old, but you have 20 years of conditioning where you've been told that you're basically anathema to our existence. And then you're told, oh, just forget about all that. You're fine now. Move on. Like, how would that feel? Of course you can't move on, right? Because part of it is that our brains and our nervous systems, that person has been wired by that conditioning. And that's very similar. We're just giving an example at an individual level, what happens in our nervous system and in our brains. And logically, we know that we're okay, we're alive, and we can move on, but our emotions don't catch up. And that's what I would say to the folks is that actually most people want to move on. They don't want to be in pain. Most people don't want to be living and reliving in their traumas, but they can't. And this is really important because oftentimes we think that bias is rational, it's logical, right? And we can fix it with policies, we can fix it with beautiful language, we can fix it with slogans, or we can fix it with science. And if we could, it wouldn't be a problem. Like our society is being torn apart because of bias, because we haven't gotten to the root of the problem, which is that bias is emotional. And in order to address this challenge, we have to meet it where it's at, which is that the cause of this is really pain, feeling other, feeling that one isn't good enough at an individual level. But then that gets extrapolated within families, within communities. So really starting there, for me, my saving grace ultimately was discovering this idea of neuroplasticity, that I took a course in mindfulness-based stress reduction, for example, really rooted in the neuroscience that, oh, wow, if we practice these tools, we can actually rewire our brains. We can rewire the ways we think. We can rewire the ways we are with one another, with ourselves. And that's what's reassuring and what we can do. And the last thing I would say is for the folks that want to say, let's move on. Yes, it's happened. That's a bad part of our history. But I think part of it is like when we say that, there's a negative emotion under it that we don't want to feel because it makes us feel guilty or ashamed of our own association with whatever group we're a part of. And that's basically what we need to get comfortable with. Because if we continue just as people do with trauma, like all these awful things happen to me, but I'm just going to suffocate it, repress it within me, it's going to manifest in so many other ways. Physical ailments, mental ailments, challenges with our spouses, with our friends, with our kids. So we have to address it. We have to heal it. And healing it actually doesn't have to be that hard, right? And this is what we want to talk about. The science and ancient wisdom gives us the ways to do this in a way that feels incredibly kind, incredibly useful, incredibly, I would say, soul giving. But in addition to that, it gives us the opportunity to really imagine who we can be individually, having that peace of mind, sense of purpose within, but also who we can be within our workplaces, within our communities, within our families.
To be able to do that, Anu, we first have to understand where these things come from. As humans, we were used to being in tribes of 150. Anything
Yeah.
beyond that, then they are the other, and we found reasons
Yeah.
for othering. So, where do stereotypes and prejudices come from in order then for us to be able to try to understand and address them?
It's such a great question. And I go into this in the book. So I really look at history that we have recorded history in the last 10,000 years. but also going to a lot of origin stories of a lot of indigenous nations and indigenous stories, including my own, right? Within the Vedic tradition, within the Buddhist tradition, within Sufi tradition, understanding just beyond what the Western sciences have created this idea that tribes used to exist with 150 people. Yes, some tribes did, but we don't have concrete evidence to that. These are theories. There's this beautiful parable that in each one of us, there's an evil wolf and a good wolf. And the good wolf within us is the one that feeds us with compassion, with kindness, with understanding. And the bad wolf is really greedy and selfish and competitive. The wolf that's going to win is the one we feed. So where the mind goes, attention flows. So that's really our opportunity. And there have been many societies, particularly in animist and indigenous traditions, that lived with one another in peace, that were rooted in what's known as inclusion paradigm, inclusion consciousness, interdependence, understanding, compassion. And then there were some that were rooted in competition and hatred, like the one you were talking about, in group, out group. The way I define bias is that it's a learned habit. It's a learned mental habit that distorts how we perceive, reason, remember, and make decisions. And there are two types of biases. There are unconscious biases, and then there are conscious biases. Conscious biases are learned false beliefs. Still a mental habit, but it's a false belief. Someone looks at me, they know that I'm gay, or I'm an immigrant, or I'm an Indian. They have a whole host of associations about me without knowing who I actually am. And unconscious bias is learned habits. So this is really at the unconscious level, like when we look at media, the way certain humans are being portrayed, the way women are being portrayed, for example, a lot of times in a very sexualized manner, those associations are being made to human bodies, but at a subliminal level. And that impacts the way we perceive ourselves and others, how we reason about ourselves and others, and then how we make decisions, and also how we remember. So that's what bias itself is. And because it's learned, it can be unlearned.
That's why what you just mentioned, Anu, becomes even more important, that mindfulness, which is part of your neuroscience based toolkit as well. I want to touch
Yeah.
on that. I love Yuval Noah Harari's writings
Yeah.
and some of his thoughts. And what he talks about is that with AI, that mindfulness becomes even more critical now
Yeah.
at a time when AI can get to know us really well.
It's so true. In his book, 21 Lessons of the 21st Century, he mentions mindfulness is one of the things we will need in this century. And I couldn't agree with him more. He's one of the three books that inspired my book itself. Reading through Sapiens, I've read it maybe 10 times and listened to it another dozen times because it gave me permission to think in deep time. Because as someone who was trained as a lawyer, as a legal academic, I was always told to just focus on my discipline and just think about that one sub issue of a sub issue and comment on it. But reading his work, I was like, oh, wow, we can actually expand the field a little bit and try to understand this from that lens. And what I discovered through my research is that what we're calling mindfulness is something humans have been doing across traditions, whether it's spiritual tradition or religious tradition, yeah, animist or non-animist countries and societies. And basically, it is our power to be aware. You mentioned PRISM. So PRISM is this somatically informed neuroscience-based toolkit I created. And it's an acronym for 5 tools. And the basis of PRISM is mindfulness. So each of the 5 letters in PRISM stands for a tool, but it starts from M and goes up to P, which is perspective taking. So with mindfulness, we become aware of what the message is, who the messenger is, why are they creating this message, and then also its impact on my body thematically, right? If you read news or watch videos that are hateful, there is a certain somatic reaction to that in our bodies. Can we become aware of that? Simultaneously, if you watch something that is showing us kindness, something that's compassion, oh, wow, that feels differently in my body. So really becoming aware. And that's where it starts. And when it comes to the idea of bias, we become mindful of what arises in our mind when we're around a certain type of a person. Let's say a person in a wheelchair. What are the assumptions we're making? Someone who wears a hijab. What are the assumptions we're making? Someone who wears a turban, someone who's dark skin, light skin, man, woman, non-binary, you name it. And then just become aware of it. There's no shame in it. One of the challenges with a lot of the backlash we've experienced around these issues over the last couple of years is because the way it's been done. It's not about the end goal because we are diverse as a human species. That's why the United Nations was created. That's why our country was created. We acknowledge diversity. We each are diverse and we are diverse as a species. But it's the way these conversations have been done, which has been laden with shame, been laden with guilt. And it's been very anecdotal. So it's felt exclusive. Like it's about one person's experience, one type of people's experience, without acknowledging our common humanity. That's been my fear actually for 10 years that I've been doing this work, which is why I felt like I had to write this book now. So let me go back to the PRISM toolkit. So we start with mindfulness, become aware of stereotypes. And then we go to S, stereotype replacement. So the second you notice that, oh, wow, there's a negative stereotype that I have about this person, you replace it with a counterexample. That's real life, right? So in the lab, let's say if you're with Black men and something negative is coming up, you replace it with an image of Dr. Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela or Desmond Tutu, all Black men, but they're not living up to that story, that false story that we have learned. Then we move to individuation. And this is really great because individuation is a bridge between the mental practice of mindfulness and stereotype replacement to more like body-based practice. Individuation is really decoupling these group-based associations from the individual. So if I'm with Anu, the human that he is, versus my ideas of Anu because of his color or his gender or something else. And then also feel what that feels like in the body. Oh, there's a little bit of uncertainty. I've never met someone who's Indian. I've never met someone who's gay. I've never met someone who's both. Right? How does that feel in the body? And then we move to hard practices, which is pro-social behaviors, which are exactly what it sounds like. So behaviors that are pro-social, things like actively cultivating loving kindness, compassion, forgiveness, gratitude, generosity, and a whole host of mental states that are positive. People are like, that just feels so weird and it feels a little woo and cuckoo. The science around this is pretty clear. Stanford Medical School has a whole center dedicated to studying these positive emotions. So does University of Wisconsin in Madison. And what practicing and cultivation of these skills, these tools is doing is changing the underlying affect, the emotional affect. So oftentimes we think about bias from a head-based way. Great, we can bridge the information gap, correct this information. But that emotional landscape beneath it of fear, which a lot of tech companies play off of, that remains. So what these tools try to do is help us feel safe with ourselves and with one another. And then we move to perspective taking, which is a capacity that so many of us have because we all watch media. And actors do this really well when they portray other people. Sometimes you go to a show or watch a movie and we get goosebumps. We're watching a fictional story, but the actor who's performing has embodied the life experience of this other being. So powerful. And that's basically imagining what it's like to be in the shoes of another being. Not how we would want them, but how they actually were given the causes and conditions of their life. And they're not special. They're humans like we are. We can build these skills. And the science around this is so clear that it takes about 3 to 8 weeks of daily practice to build a habit. So we can practice these PRISM tools and literally break bias within a month or two, but it requires regular practice and commitment.
I absolutely love the Prism tools that you have, Anu, because what you have done with this is taken something that is a lot of times talked about conceptually from a
Yeah.
principle perspective and broken it down to practices that we can engage in as
Yeah.
individuals in order for us to make progress. So it's not just conceptually agreeing, it enables us to actually do something about it to make progress on our own levels. That's what I most appreciate about it.
Yeah. Thank you. That was really important to me. And one of the challenges that I've experienced, I was trained as a human rights lawyer and then social scientist going into legal academia. Never thought that I would move into this industry of breaking bias, mental health, and DEI. But it just happened. That's where I was placed. And I don't know if I'll remain in there. But my ultimate purpose is really to give people tools so they can feel more connected to themselves and one another and really save on the costs of bias. Let's not forget, particularly if you're a business owner, if you're a business leader, bias is really expensive. It costs so much money. It's really inefficient for our people to have bias. And oftentimes I meet with business leaders, they're like, that's why we're creating AI. I'm like, that's even worse because what's happening is that the data sets upon which these algorithms are being built are flawed because they're rooted in the biases of the humans that created them. So this is why we need to get this right. Otherwise, we're going to be in a whole lot of trouble.
And the AI, whether for the applicant tracking systems or other tools, it has drawn from a large data set and it
Yeah,
has inferred biases that you might not have thought of before yourself.
exactly. It's so true. I'll give three examples. Like someone named Deshaun, generally an African American name. The person has all the degrees, has great resume, but because the data set found 20,000 other Deshans with a criminal history, this one candidate was rejected. This is just an example, right? So basically, it impacts this person, it impacts the company who couldn't hire a great contact. Facial recognition technology, this is still a problem. Driverless cars driving over Black and brown people because they can't see them because it wasn't coded in. Because the person designing it didn't think about, as we see with any and all Hollywood movies about Black and brown people. And I'll go on a sidetrack there. So this past weekend, I went to see the most recent Despicable Me series. My nieces really wanted to see it. It was really fun. We had a great time. They loved the Minions. But it was so interesting because in the previews, with the exception of the Pharrell movie that's going to come out at some point later this year, all the movies were with white people, and that's it. And even in the entire film, Despicable Me, there were no characters of color other than like a few here and there in the background. And it was like, wow, like we're a country that's almost 45% of color. And there's no representation of any of us, whether we're Asian American or Black or Indigenous or mixed race. So it was just interesting. And I'm pretty sure the people that are creating these movies aren't consciously like, oh, we want to make sure that Black and brown people are not in this film. But they're just not thinking about it. But it has a huge impact on so many people across the board, millions around the world, and how they feel about themselves and how they feel about others, like who is human and who isn't.
And you do address the impact of whether it is policy or media on our biases. One of the things I want to get your thoughts on, Anu, is that I love the PRISM toolkit that you have shared with respect to the journey we can go on. I wonder if it is a journey we can bring other people on as well. So,
Yeah,
as a team leader, bring the team, as a CEO, bring the rest of the organization. Because part of the backlash that I've seen is people who have not been ready for one reason or another, who have not thought it, have been given a mandate, a training, whatever,
yeah,
oftentimes not done well,
yeah,
where, if anything, it produces a counter impact. So,
yeah,
what are your thoughts on how others can be brought along on this journey? And
yeah.
can they?
The answer is absolutely yes, which is why I wrote the book. It has over 130 exercises that I'm really hoping the leaders go on with me in the safety and security of their own space, their own homes, their own minds. So I think that it's really important what you've shared. And my dream one day is that these PRISM tools will be taught in school, like in elementary school, in middle school. So just as we have subjects like math and literature and history from an early age, there's actually a class every year that gives young people an understanding of their own brain, the understanding of their own behavior, and how these tools can help them, how can support them in managing and regulating their emotional life. But until we get to that day, what we need to do right now is really bring people along. And one of the reasons why the backlash has existed, like you said, it's not just these mandates that have been superimposed on people, but the quality and the content that's been given to them has not been rooted in adult learning methodology. So I invite everyone to bring everyone else along, but it's really important to understand how adults learn, which is it needs to be playful, needs to be inviting, and it needs to be kind. If those things are missing, particularly if there's shame, what happens in our nervous system is that we get triggered. Our nervous system shuts down and we can't learn. And that's what's happened with a lot of training is that it shuts people's nervous systems. And then that curiosity is completely shut down and people are in this fight and flight response. My invitation really is we have to bring this to everyone we know and do it with kindness and compassion, which is why in my introduction in the book, I have shared agreements, 5 shared agreements that I really hope people follow for themselves as they go through the book, but also with the people they engage with, because it's so important to build trust around this stuff. Because ultimately, bias is personal and it's painful. And I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're the richest, the whitest, and the most European person in the world. You've experienced bias. Maybe because you're short. Maybe because you're the middle child. Maybe because of an addiction of some sort. You have a felt sense experience of what the suffering of bias feels like. And part of the opportunity is for us to really own that, feel that for ourselves. And once we do that for ourselves, we can then do it for others as well.
Which is why we should come from it from a perspective of inclusion, Anu, rather than
Yeah.
exclusion. One of
Yeah.
the mistakes I've seen people with good intentions make in trying to promote diversity and inclusion in organizations and trying to address
Mm.
bias is that they've approached it as an issue of exclusion, therefore causes a lot of hostility
Beautifully
rather
said.
than one that seeks inclusion, as
Beautifully
you
said.
mentioned, of all people, all of their experiences.
Beautifully said. It's so true. And I think to come from that mindset of inclusion really requires a sense of curiosity, a sense of wonder, a sense of awe. Again, all of those pro-social behaviors. And most importantly, to give others the benefit of the doubt. I have a chapter in the book on gender. Most people have been through, if you're in a workplace, a sexual harassment training or something along those lines. And it's always felt like half of the population is bad and the other half is a victim. Men are bad because they're sexual predators, and women are the victims who have no agency and need to be protected. I'm making a gross generalization, but that's how it feels emotionally for most of us. But sexism is bad for everyone, including men. It sucks for us because there are all sorts of expectations that we have to live up to because of this construct of what a man is supposed to be. And so for me in this chapter, I use my experience as a man, right? And like to get at this challenge, which of course creates so much suffering for people who are not men, but it also creates a lot of suffering for people who are men. We know that from the data, rates of addiction, rates of mental health challenges, suicidality among men, among straight men is so high because they can't really be their full emotional being. And we have to really look at this as, like you said, from a place of inclusion. How do we bring people in and see each other suffering, their pain, and then work to create solutions to it?
That is a beautiful way of being able to get closer to that ideal of achieving a bias free world. Now, there has been backtracking by organizations from a
Yeah,
couple of different perspectives. One, it's been there, done that with the training.
yeah,
Two, they're hemming and hawing because some of their stakeholders are pressuring them
yeah,
to not focus as much on these
yeah,
issues. Would love to know your perspectives on what is it going to take. To a certain extent, the pendulum has swung. What is it
yeah,
going to take to get the pendulum to swing in the right direction? Because I think it's possible that we didn't do it well last time around, which is some of
yeah.
the reasons for some of the backlash now.
Yeah, and I think it's something that a lot of us are wondering ourselves across the spectrum. So one of the things that's really important to understand is what is the goal? Like, why are these initiatives created in the first place? Why did the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission established in 1972 or 1973? Why was the Civil Rights Act passed? Why was this legislation needed? And the ultimate goal of all of this legislation, anti-discrimination legislation policies, has been behavior change to support people in changing their behavior. So the goal of policy is to really create standards. So policies, for those of you who haven't read the book, is the second root cause of bias. It's really important to understand this. It regulates what we can do, what we can do, what's right, what's wrong for us to live together in a society. Now, behavior change, of course, can tell us these things, but what it also requires is training. So oftentimes you call these things training, right? Diversity training, sexual harassment training. But how often are we actually getting trained? We're being told things do this, don't do that. But we aren't being trained to think differently. We aren't given the skill. We're told that you should go practice mindfulness, but go figure it out on your own. You've told me what mindfulness is, but we haven't really done mindfulness. That's the challenge. That's been the challenge with a lot of these trainings is that they haven't actually done the work of behavior change, supporting folks with the tools, the skills they need to be more curious, to be more empathetic. And that's the goal of PRISM for me. Now, with respect to the backlash, that's a bigger story. It's not just about how a lot of the trainings were conducted, but it's become politicized. Our identities, our existence has become politicized, it's become a political issue around right and wrong. And that is once again the seed of exclusion because a lot of the people that are promoting the backlash are rooted in this idea of us versus them and a right way of being human. Everyone else is wrong. My existence is right. And in order for you to be right, you have to be like me. And that's what happened to me 15 years ago because I was trying to be something I couldn't. However many times I tried to wash my face, it wouldn't become white. It just won't. We have so many examples of this from history. So that is a larger struggle that we're all a part of. And I really feel like it's going to be the challenge of our century. Like 100 years ago in this country, it was the challenge of segregation and exclusion of non-white people. 200 years ago, it was slavery, owning people. I think this century, we have to now move beyond all these false concepts and labels of us versus them around identity, around race and gender and sexuality and political beliefs, and really be like, who do we want to be as a nation? Who do we want to be as a global society? And can we really lean on inclusion? In the family that I grew up with, there's this idea that I was introduced to very early, live and let live. Really beautiful, right? Simple. What is it going to take for us to get there? Why is my existence preventing others from living? It's not. But those ideas, right? Those stories connected to my humanity is somehow affecting people. And that's what we have to address.
It is a big challenge that we have, Anu, but the work first begins with us. The first step to change is the me, working on myself,
Yeah.
working on my perspective taking, my pro social behaviors, up to
Yes.
my mindfulness.
Yes.
And then the sphere of influence I have around me. I think we are much more likely to be able to make a difference in the world if we
Yes.
view it that way rather than the them. Because on the other side of it, I do live in a very pro equity and inclusion bubble. And I hear lots of conversation that is exclusionary about the them that don't get it.
Yeah,
And the them
exactly.
that don't get it do need perspective taking as well. So I love the exercises that you've shared, the frameworks that you've shared. For me and for us, it's not for they and for them.
For us. Exactly. Yeah, we are the change we've been waiting for. When Gandhi said, be the change you wish to see in the world. If you wish to see more peace, be peace. You wish to see more compassion, be compassion. You wish to see more inclusion, be inclusion.
So, to that end, Anu, in addition to your book, are there any other books or resources you typically find yourself recommending as people want to go deeper into this journey of breaking their own bias?
Yeah. 3 books that inspired me to write this book were Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent, Sapiens, and The Dawn of Everything. So these are all a little bit more academic on the heady side, but really talk about how human hierarchies have come about. And my book really goes into this idea of bias and how we learn it and how we did unlearn it. The other book that I loved, absolutely loved, is The Book of Joy. It's a collaboration between His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu, who were lifelong friends. They've both been through a lot in their lives around this idea of bias and oppression and marginalization. And yet they carry with them this idea of joy. So the book is, of course, a joy to read, but also gives us a lot of life skills on how we can move through what may seem scary and uncertain in our times.
And it must have been a joy for you to get the Dalai Lama to write the foreword for your book.
Oh, goodness. It was a blessing beyond imaginable. And yeah, I really feel like his name on the cover is like a spiritual shield for this work.
Anu, for the audience to find out more about your book, follow your work, where would you send them to?
So go to my website, anuguptany.com. So ANUGUPTANY.com. Also, you can find me at Anu Gupta NY on all social media, Instagram, Twitter, X, Facebook, and other places.
I really appreciate the conversation and
Yeah.
love the book, Breaking Bias, Where Stereotypes and Prejudices Come From, and the science backed method to unravel them. Thank you so much for the conversation, Anu Gupta.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mahan. It's wonderful to be here.